What happens when a trusted insider, someone who stood beside the Queen for decades, steps forward and reveals what was never meant to leave the palace corridors? In a moment that stunned royal watchers and sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace, the Queen's former lady-in-waiting delivered testimony that didn't just revisit the past, it threatened to rewrite the future. And at the center of it all stood one woman who had remained silent until now. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For decades, the lady-in-waiting was more than a ceremonial presence. She was a constant shadow in the Queen's most private hours, a living archive of whispered conversations, sealed letters, and decisions made when the cameras were gone and the doors were closed. She had stood at the monarch's side through wars of public opinion, family fractures, and moments of fragile reconciliation. To many within palace walls, she was not simply staff, she was loyalty embodied, which is why her decision to testify under oath in proceedings never intended for public consumption felt less like a statement and more like a detonation. The setting itself was shrouded in secrecy. A closed legal review, convened quietly to address lingering estate matters after the Queen's passing, was expected to be routine, a formality, a final administrative sweep. No one anticipated revelation. No one expected the calm, deliberate voice of a woman who had guarded royal secrets for half a century to utter words that would ripple beyond the room. Yet she did. And when she spoke Duchess Sophie's name, the temperature changed. According to her testimony, there existed a previously undisclosed inheritance, carefully structured, intentionally private, and directly tied to Sophie. Not an honorary gift, not a sentimental keepsake, an inheritance with weight, substance, intention. The kind of transfer that suggests forethought rather than affection alone. The room, by insider accounts, fell silent. Legal advisors exchanged glances. Pens paused mid-note, because this was not something that had appeared in the official summaries made public after the Queen's death. Within hours, the palace machinery began to move. Engagements were quietly postponed. Internal briefings were called. Communications teams shifted from routine scheduling to crisis containment. The monarchy has weathered storms before, but this felt different. This was not an external attack. This was something emerging from within, an assertion that the late Queen had made a deliberate, perhaps controversial, choice in her final arrangements. Outside the palace gates, speculation ignited instantly. Commentators debated whether this inheritance involved estates, rare collections, or discrete financial holdings. Others suggested something even more powerful: symbolic authority, influence over private trusts, or stewardship of legacy assets that shape the monarchy's unseen foundation. Was this about wealth, or was it about positioning? The question spread faster than answers could contain it, and hovering over everything was a deeper tension. Why had Duchess Sophie never addressed the whispers? For months, even years, subtle rumors had circulated about her closeness to the Queen in her final chapter, yet she had remained composed, disciplined, unwaveringly silent. Some interpreted it as humility, others suspected strategy. Now, that silence felt heavier, intentional, as if she had been waiting for the truth to surface on its own. More intriguing still were the lady-in-waiting's carefully chosen words. She did not describe the inheritance as a reward. She described it as a decision, a measured act by a monarch known for caution. That nuance changed everything. Because if this inheritance was strategic rather than sentimental, then it hinted at foresight, a final move placed quietly on the chessboard before the Queen exited the stage. And as the shock began to settle into something colder and more calculated, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not just about what Sophie received. It was about why she received it. But to understand why this testimony cut so deeply into the monarchy's core, we must go back to the quiet bond that formed between the Queen and Sophie long before the world was watching. Long before headlines erupted and whispers filled drawing rooms, there was a quieter story unfolding behind palace doors, a story of loyalty, resilience, and a bond that many insiders claim rivaled even the closest blood ties. While others fought for visibility, Duchess Sophie moved differently. She didn't demand attention, she earned trust. And that trust, according to those who knew the Queen best, may have changed everything. In the beginning, Sophie's entrance into royal life was anything but seamless. She faced scrutiny that felt relentless, missteps magnified beyond proportion, and a press cycle eager to question whether she truly belonged within an institution built on centuries of inherited certainty. There were awkward interviews, moments of public doubt, and the quiet humiliation of learning palace protocol under unforgiving eyes. But what set her apart was not perfection, it was persistence. She absorbed criticism without retaliation. She recalibrated without complaint. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to transform from outsider to indispensable. During some of the monarchy's most turbulent chapters, family rifts, public scandals, and internal tensions that threatened to fracture unity, Sophie did not position herself at the center. Instead, she became the steady presence in the bar, the reliable voice in private discussions, the calm intermediary when emotions ran high. While others defended titles or battled narratives, she focused on consistency. That consistency did not go unnoticed, particularly not by the Queen. In the later years, as the weight of reign and responsibility pressed more heavily than ever, reports began to surface of private weekly audiences between the Queen and Sophie. These were not ceremonial encounters staged for tradition. They were conversations described by insiders as candid, thoughtful, and deeply personal. It was in these exchanges, some believe, that a deeper trust was forged, not the dramatic loyalty of public declarations, but the quieter kind built through listening, through understanding, through shared perspective. As family strain intensified in various corners of the monarchy, the Queen's reliance on Sophie appeared to grow. When tensions escalated behind closed doors, Sophie was often present, not as a decision-maker on paper, but as a stabilizing force in reality. Her counsel was sought more frequently, her presence requested more deliberately. There were moments when seasoned courtiers quietly acknowledged that Sophie carried responsibilities far beyond what her official title suggested. Subtle signs began to accumulate, the Queen choosing Sophie's company at certain engagements where symbolism mattered, a deliberate proximity at ceremonies that sent quiet signals to those fluent in royal nuance. Personal gifts exchanged not merely as tokens of affection, but as acknowledgements of shared understanding. Observers within the palace noticed patterns forming, patterns that hinted at preparation. Was Sophie being shaped for something greater than anyone publicly realized? That question lingered beneath the surface long before the lady-in-waiting ever testified. Because loyalty at that level is rarely accidental, it is cultivated, tested, proven. And in Sophie's case, it seemed to mature during the monarchy's most fragile moments. The contrast was striking. She entered under doubt and emerged under quiet confidence. She endured pressure and responded with composure. She moved from uncertainty to proximity, from peripheral figure to trusted confidant, and through it all, she never sought validation. She simply continued to show up. Looking back now, in the wake of the inheritance revelation, those years take on new meaning. The private conversations, the shared appearances, the Queen's subtle affirmations. They no longer appear incidental. They feel intentional, as though groundwork was being laid beneath the surface while the world remained distracted elsewhere. And then came the moment no one anticipated, the testimony that hinted this quiet loyalty had been formally recognized in ways that could alter the monarchy's balance of power. When the lady-in-waiting spoke, the room reportedly fell into stunned silence. It wasn't just what she revealed, it was how certain she sounded. According to her sworn words, a hidden clause existed within the Queen's private inheritance documents. A clause referencing Duchess Sophie by name, not in passing, not symbolically, but directly, and what that clause suggested left even seasoned royal advisors scrambling for answers. The wording, as recounted in testimony, was precise and unmistakable. It did not cloak itself in vague sentiment or ceremonial language. It outlined a deliberate transfer, assets held in private trust, discretionary authority over select holdings, and custodianship of items described only as personal yet institutionally significant. That phrasing alone ignited alarm. Personal yet institutionally significant. It hinted at more than jewelry or heirlooms. It suggested influence, responsibility, perhaps even quiet, leverage embedded within the monarchy's inner framework. Legal representatives immediately requested sealed documents for verification. Files that had rested untouched since the Queen's passing were retrieved under strict protocol. Behind closed doors, specialists pored over clauses, drafted with the meticulous care of a monarch who understood the weight of every word she signed. The discovery was not theatrical, it was clinical, and that made it more powerful, because nothing in those pages appeared accidental. What unsettled advisors most was the implication that this inheritance extended beyond wealth. Estates were mentioned in coded reference, as were curated collections accumulated over decades. There were suggestions of oversight roles, positions not publicly announced yet privately authorized. If confirmed, this meant Sophie had been entrusted with stewardship that carried long-term consequences. It meant the Queen had placed faith, not merely in affection, but in judgment. The question echoed almost immediately. Why was this not disclosed when the Queen's will was formally summarized to the public? Official statements at the time had been measured, respectful, restrained. They acknowledged distribution of property without detail. No mention of expanded authority, no indication that Sophie's role had been elevated in any structural sense. The omission now felt conspicuous. Was it an oversight, or a conscious decision to delay disclosure until circumstances demanded clarity? Inside palace corridors, the emotional response was swift and layered. Shock gave way to disbelief. Disbelief evolved into whispered accusation. Some interpreted the clause as a protective measure crafted during a period of instability within the family. Others feared it signaled a recalibration of influence that few had anticipated. There were quiet conversations about timing. When exactly had this clause been drafted? Was it during one of the monarchy's more turbulent chapters, when loyalty was being quietly measured and weighed? Outside those walls, the media narrative accelerated with breathtaking speed. Commentators framed it as a potential royal reshuffle from beyond the grave. Analysts debated whether the Queen had subtly reinforced one branch of the family while bypassing others. Public fascination intensified. The idea that a monarch could alter the internal balance of power through carefully constructed language long after her passing felt both dramatic and plausible. It fed into a broader intrigue that even in death, the Queen's hand remained firmly on the chessboard. And at the center of every headline stood Sophie, calm, composed, unwaveringly silent. The clause did not portray her as opportunistic, it portrayed her as selected. That distinction mattered. It suggested deliberation rather than reward. It implied trust earned through years of consistency rather than sudden favoritism. But that very implication stirred discomfort. Because if the Queen had made such a calculated choice, it meant she had foreseen something, perhaps vulnerability, perhaps transition, that others had not fully acknowledged. As legal teams continued their review and palace strategists assessed potential fallout, the tension shifted from what the clause contained to what it meant, not only for the monarchy's assets, but for its future alignment. And as the legal implications began to unfold, attention shifted toward one crucial question. Why had Sophie remained silent for so long? For years, rumors swirled quietly, yet Duchess Sophie never confirmed, denied, or even hinted at what insiders suspected. Was her silence loyalty, fear, or a calculated decision to protect the crown from fracture? As speculation mounted, one thing became clear. This was not the silence of Samo, ne'er, unaware. It was the silence of someone waiting, for the right moment or the right reason. In the wake of the Queen's passing, when the world dissected every gesture and every carefully chosen word, Sophie remained unwavering. Questions surfaced in subtle waves at first, about her closeness to the late monarch, about private meetings that seemed more frequent than tradition required, about whether she held knowledge others did not. Journalists probed gently, commentators speculated cautiously, yet she offered nothing, no clarification, no defense, only composure. Palace protocol has always drawn a firm boundary around matters of wills and inheritance. Discussions of personal bequests are considered private, almost sacred. Breaking that code risks not only reputational damage, but institutional destabilization. Sophie understood this. To speak prematurely would have been to violate a system she had spent years proving she respected. And so she held her silence, even as whispers sharpened into pointed questions. But silence carries weight, especially when it conceals something potentially divisive. Those closest to the inner circle began to sense that Sophie's restraint was not indifference, but burden. To carry knowledge that could shift perceptions of hierarchy is no small task. It demands discipline. It demands emotional control. Imagine standing among family members, attending formal gatherings, sharing moments of grief, all while knowing a truth that, if revealed carelessly, could fracture trust. That kind of restraint does not come without cost. During the Queen's funeral period, when cameras captured grief in its most solemn form, Sophie's composure stood out. She did not draw attention to herself. She did not step beyond her role, yet there was a gravity to her presence that some observers later described as different, not louder, just deeper, as if she were guarding something unseen. In hindsight, that quiet steadiness feels less coincidental and more intentional. There are indications she may have been legally bound to confidentiality, documents sealed, conditions stipulated, a time frame perhaps imposed. If true, that would explain her absolute refusal to engage publicly. It would also suggest that her silence was not merely personal choice, but contractual obligation, a promise enforced not only by loyalty, but by law. And that possibility reframes everything, because it means she was not withholding out of ambition, but out of duty. As rumors intensified within the extended royal family, tension grew harder to ignore. Conversations became guarded, interpretations multiplied. Some may have wondered whether Sophie's silence signaled advantage. Others may have feared it concealed strategy. The atmosphere, insiders suggest, grew strained in ways that never reached the public stage. And through it all, she remained still. Yet even the most disciplined silence reaches a breaking point. The lady-in-waiting's testimony altered the equation. What had once been speculation was now formal record. What had once been rumor was now sworn statement. And in that shift, Sophie faced a choice she could no longer postpone. Continue withholding and risk appearing deceptive, or speak and risk unsettling the very institution she sought to protect. Sources close to the matter suggest there was a private moment of reckoning, a realization that silence, once protective, could now be interpreted as concealment. And so, after years of restraint, she prepared to step forward. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately. And when she did break her silence, it wasn't with denial. It was with words that stunned even her closest allies. In a carefully worded but emotionally charged address, Duchess Sophie did what she had avoided for years. She acknowledged the inheritance. But instead of fueling division, her statement introduced an entirely new dimension to the story. She spoke not of entitlement, but of duty, not of reward, but of responsibility. And in doing so, she reframed the narrative in a way no one anticipated. When she finally stepped forward, there was no triumph in her tone, no trace of defensiveness. She did not deny the clause, she did not minimize it. She confirmed with measured clarity that the Queen had indeed entrusted her with specific responsibilities outlined in private documentation, but she was deliberate in her language. She avoided the word inheritance where she could, choosing instead phrases like stewardship, guardianship, and continuation of service. It was a subtle shift, but a powerful one. She described the Queen's wishes not as a personal favor, but as a solemn expectation, an obligation to preserve certain traditions, a duty to safeguard elements of the crown that operate beyond public view. Without revealing explicit details, she hinted that what had been passed to her was less about possession and more about protection. And in that distinction, she altered the emotional temperature of the entire debate. There was gratitude in her words, unmistakable and deeply felt. She spoke of the Queen not as a monarch, but as a mentor, as a steady force during uncertain years. Yet beneath that gratitude lay visible restraint. She did not elaborate beyond what was necessary. She did not indulge speculation. She held the line with precision. as if aware that a single misplaced sentence could reignite controversy. What startled observers most was her refusal to cast blame. She did not accuse critics of misunderstanding. She did not reference internal tensions. She acknowledged that confusion was natural when private matters surface unexpectedly. In doing so, she positioned herself not as a claimant asserting rights, but as a servant accepting weight. That posture disarmed some critics and unsettled others, because in affirming the Queen's wishes, she implicitly confirmed that the late monarch had made a conscious decision, a strategic one. That realization rippled outward. Senior royals responded with statements that were polite, controlled, and carefully neutral. Yet insiders described the atmosphere as tense, not hostile, not openly divided, but charged. There were private conversations about optics, about timing, about what this acknowledgement might mean for ceremonial precedence and internal influence. Analysts quickly dissected every phrase of her address. Some argued that her emphasis on responsibility suggested an expanded advisory role. Others speculated that symbolic authority, control over specific trusts, oversight of private collections, or influence within certain councils could subtly elevate her standing. The question lingered: had the Queen quietly recalibrated the monarchy's internal architecture before her passing? The contrast was striking. For years, Sophie had endured scrutiny in silence, carrying rumours without defence. Now, when she finally spoke, she did so not to claim power, but to accept burden. That shift reshaped public perception almost overnight. Supporters praised her composure, critics questioned the broader implications, and within the palace, the equilibrium felt delicate, because while her words were crafted for unity, their impact was undeniable. By acknowledging the clause openly, she closed the door on secrecy, but opened another on consequence. The inheritance was no longer abstract. It was affirmed, defined not by speculation, but by her own voice, and that made it real in a way it had never been before. Yet even as she sought unity, cracks began to surface, because not everyone inside the palace welcomed this revelatio. Behind the gilded doors of royal residences, unity is often carefully choreographed, but insiders claim that after Sophie's statement, closed-door meetings grew heated. Was this inheritance merely sentimental, or did it represent influence that unsettled established roles? As advisors debated protocol and precedents, whispers of rivalry began circulating once again. What followed her address was not public confrontation, but private calculation. Emergency consultations were reportedly convened with urgency that surprised even seasoned aides. Senior family members gathered in rooms where conversations are rarely recorded and never repeated. The tone, according to those familiar with the mood, was not explosive, but it was intense. Questions were asked that had been avoided for years. Not about affection, about authority. If the inheritance carried symbolic weight, what did that mean for ceremonial order? The monarchy thrives on structure: who stands where, who speaks first, who represents the crown in moments of significance. Even subtle shifts can send signals far beyond palace walls. Some advisors began scrutinizing upcoming engagements with fresh sensitivity. Would Sophie's presence now be interpreted differently? Would proximity imply endorsement? Every detail suddenly felt loaded. Beyond ceremony lay the deeper issue of perception. Public sympathy is a currency within modern monarchy. Sophie's composed acknowledgement had won admiration from many observers. That surge of goodwill did not go unnoticed internally. Concern grew that narrative momentum could quietly elevate her influence in ways no formal decree ever stated. In an institution where balance is everything, even perception can tilt scales. There were also conversations about long-term optics. Succession is not merely about lineage. It is about image, continuity, and public confidence. If the Queen had intentionally entrusted Sophie with responsibilities that extend beyond personal keepsakes, what message did that send about trust within the next generation? Did it imply endorsement of certain leadership styles, certain values? These questions lingered in strategic briefings, not as accusations, but as anxieties. Emotion, though unspoken publicly, threaded through it all. Jealousy is rarely admitted in royal settings, But uncertainty has a way of surfacing in coded language. Defensiveness appeared in careful phrasing. Silence carried sharper edges. For years, roles had been understood without needing articulation. Now they were being re-examined quietly, but unmistakably. The inheritance had not changed titles, yet it had unsettled equilibrium. To prevent visible fragmentation, coordinated efforts were initiated, joint appearances were discussed. Carefully balanced schedules were drafted. Statements emphasizing unity were refined and reviewed. The objective was clear: reinforce cohesion before speculation spiraled further. The monarchy's strength lies in its projection of stability, and stability must be protected, especially when internal recalibrations are underway. Yet beneath these strategic maneuvers lingered a suspicion that the story was incomplete. The clause itself had been revealed. Yes, Sophie had acknowledged responsibility, yes. But why had the Queen chosen that particular moment in history to formalize such a decision? What pressures existed when the documents were drafted? What private realities influenced her pen? Those questions hovered over every discussion, unanswered and increasingly difficult to ignore. Because inheritance, in this context, was not just a transfer of property. It was a statement, a message from a monarch who understood symbolism better than anyone. And the more advisors examined its implications, the more it became clear that the true catalyst may not have been political calculation alone. But the most unexpected twist wasn't political, it was personal, and it reached back into the Queen's final days. In the final months of her life, the Queen reportedly held a series of deeply private conversations that only a handful of confidants witnessed. According to the Lady-in-Waiting's testimony, Sophie was present more often than anyone realized, and within those quiet exchanges may lie the true meaning of the inheritance, not as a prize, but as a promise. As the Queen's strength began to fade, the rhythm of her engagement slowed, but the intensity of her private reflections deepened. Those who observed from a respectful distance noted a shift. The public duties continued, yet behind closed doors there was contemplation, measured, deliberate, almost urgent. It was during this fragile chapter that Sophie's visits became more frequent. Not ceremonial appearances, not orchestrated meetings, but quiet hours spent in conversation that carried a weight few could fully comprehend. The Lady-in-Waiting's voice reportedly trembled when recounting those moments. She described exchanges that were not about jewels or estates, but about continuity, about safeguarding the essence of an institution that had endured storms precisely because it adapted without losing its core. The Queen, aware of time slipping beyond her control, is said to have spoken candidly about stability, about ensuring that after her departure, the crown would not fracture under competing ambitions or emotional strain. Sophie, according to testimony, listened more than she spoke. She absorbed concerns that had been carefully guarded for decades. The Queen allegedly confided fears, not dramatic fears, but quiet apprehensions about how shifting public sentiment and internal tensions might test the monarchy's resilience. There were discussions of tradition, not as rigid rule, but as living memory, of values that must be protected not for appearance, but for integrity. It was within those conversations that the inheritance begins to look different, not a transfer of wealth, but a reinforcement of trust. If the clause was drafted during this period, it suggests intention shaped by vulnerability, a monarch who had witnessed triumph and turmoil alike choosing, in her final stretch, someone she believed would preserve balance rather than seek dominance. That distinction matters. It transforms the narrative from favoritism to foresight. There were also personal gestures, small, deliberate tokens passed quietly before any formal announcements were made, items imbued with history, notes written in a hand that had signed treaties and declarations for decades. These were not grand displays, they were intimate affirmations, signals of confidence placed not before cameras, but within the privacy of shared understanding. The Lady-in-Waiting described these moments not with gossip, but with reverence, as if she were reliving something sacred. The emotional weight of it all cannot be overstated. To sit with a sovereign confronting mortality is to witness both fragility and resolve. Sophie's presence during that time speaks volumes. She was not summoned for spectacle. She was there because she was trusted, because in the Queen's most unguarded reflections, she was considered steady. And when the inheritance is viewed through that lens, its meaning shifts entirely. It becomes less about property and more about legacy, less about elevation and more about expectation. The Queen was not distributing assets randomly. She was shaping continuity, quietly, carefully, perhaps even protectively. Which brings us to the heart of the matter. If this was indeed a promise, an understanding forged in the final chapter of a historic gen, then the implications extend far beyond one individual's role. They touch the very architecture of the monarchy's future, and that realization leads to the final, unavoidable question: what does this mean for the monarchy's future? An inheritance can be measured in pounds and estates, but sometimes its true weight is invisible. As Duchess Sophie steps into a role few predicted yet many now scrutinize, the monarchy finds itself subtly reshaped, not by scandal alone, but by the quiet assertion of loyalty rewarded. And in that shift lies a deeper truth about power, trust, and legacy. What has changed is not a title printed in bold or a line of succession rewritten overnight. What has shifted is perception. For years, Sophie operated in the margins of public fascination, respected, steady, rarely sensational. Now, the acknowledgement of the Queen's private trust reframes her entire journey. The woman once underestimated for her restraint is suddenly viewed as a chosen guardian of something far more profound. Public sympathy has matured into admiration. Curiosity has turned into reconsideration, and that recalibration alone alters the monarchy's emotional landscape. This moment also highlights the delicate balance between tradition and adaptation. The crown survives because it evolves without appearing to bend. By entrusting Sophie with responsibility during her final chapter, the Queen may have demonstrated precisely that principle. She did not disrupt the established order publicly. She did not ignite overt change. Instead, she reinforced the institution quietly, ensuring that someone aligned with her values would safeguard certain pillars from within. It was strategic thinking wrapped in subtlety, a final act of long-term planning by a monarch who understood legacy better than anyone. For Sophie, the path forward will not be louder, but it will be heavier. Her role may come with dramatic announcements, yet expectations will shadow her every move. Each engagement will carry added interpretation. Each decision will be measured against the trust she was granted. Loyalty, once invisible, has now been validated, and with validation comes responsibility that cannot be shrugged off. She must embody steadiness, not just for herself, but for the promise she represents. There is emotional resonance in that arc. Years of silence, of enduring scrutiny without retaliation, have culminated in recognition that feels less like triumph and more like confirmation. It is the contrast that makes it powerful. The suffering of doubt transformed into the strength of endorsement. The quiet years were not wasted, they were proving ground, and now the result stands before the public, undeniable. The ripple effects extend beyond Sophie alone. Younger royals observing this chapter will absorb its lesson. Influence within the monarchy is not always secured through volume or visibility. Sometimes it is earned through patience, consistency, and unwavering loyalty. That realization could shape the tone of the next generation. It suggests that the Queen's final message was not about rearranging hierarchy, but about reinforcing character. In the broader view, this episode reaffirms something essential. The monarchy does not endure solely through bloodlines or ceremony. It endures through trust, through individuals who carry burdens without demanding applause, through decisions made in silence that only later reveal their significance. Sophie's inheritance, stripped of sensationalism, stands as evidence of that philosophy. Because in the end, this was never just about inheritance. It was about who the Queen believed could quietly carry her legacy when she no longer could. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.